Hello, I'm Alan Cooperman. I'm Director of Religion Research at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining this important conversation today. I'd like to take just a moment to explain how it came about. A few months ago, we completed a large nationwide survey aimed at understanding how the religious views of U.S. adults affect what they think and do about the environment, particularly climate change. We found two very strong patterns across a wide range of survey questions. One pattern is that Americans who are highly religious tend to be less concerned about climate change. The other strong pattern is that young adults, those under 30, tend to be more concerned than older Americans, particularly those over age 50, about the environment in general and climate change in particular. I love our survey data, and I hope you do too, because we work hard to get it right and to present it impartially. But survey numbers can seem pretty abstract and dry, even when the issues involved are ones people feel passionately about. So we thought, let's bring the numbers to life by inviting a few people who are both religious and young, still in their 20s, for a public conversation about the role of religion in their lives and their views on the environment, and how those two things intertwine or come together in various ways. And we couldn't have found a better moderator than the Reverend Leah Shade, an associate professor of preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary in Lexington, Kentucky. An ordained Lutheran minister for more than 20 years, Leah is a renowned preacher and someone that clergy across the country look to for guidance in how to incorporate environmental perspectives into their sermons and worship services. Partway through their conversation, Leah and the panel will take questions from our online audience. Please type your questions into the question bar at the bottom of your screen, and they will be curated and passed on to the panel. Of course, no panel of three people can possibly be representative of all Americans, or even of all young religious Americans. So to set the factual context for the conversation between Dr. Shade and our panel, my colleague, Becca Alper, will brief you on some of the key findings of our national survey, for which she was the project manager. Dr. Alper is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center and earned her master's and doctoral degrees in sociology of religion at Purdue University. Finally, I should note that Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. We don't take positions on policy issues. We're also a nonprofit organization. We don't have any clients or advertisers, and we don't sell anything to anyone. We study religion because we think it matters to individuals and to societies, but we don't promote any particular religion or religious beliefs over non-religious beliefs in general. Our funding comes primarily from our parent organization, the Pew Charitable Trusts. For this survey on religion and the environment, we also received a generous grant from the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. And now please welcome my wonderful colleague, Dr. Becca Alper.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Alan. The survey I'll be talking about today was conducted on Pew Research Center's American Trends Panel, which is our nationally representative survey of U.S. adults. I'm sorry. There we go. I'm getting used to the platform, which is our nationally representative online panel that we've run for 9 years now. We've talked with over 10,000 panelists last April about their views on the environment and climate change. I'll just give you a quick overview of some of the report's findings and then do a mini deep dive on some specific points that highlight how younger religious Americans are more concerned about climate change. So most U.S. adults consider the earth sacred and believe God gave humans a duty to care for it. At the same time, highly religious Americans, these are people who say they pray each day, they regularly attend religious services, and they consider religion very important in their lives, are less likely than U.S. adults with lower levels of religious commitment to say climate change is an extremely or very serious problem. Highly religious Americans are also more likely than those who are less religious to expect a gradual loss of individual freedoms within the next 30 years because of environmental regulations. And they are more worried that the government will overreact to global climate change in the coming decades by creating many unnecessary environmental regulations. To walk through a specific example, evangelical Protestants are less likely than other religiously affiliated Americans and those who don't affiliate with a religion to be concerned about climate change. Evangelical Protestants are also more likely than members of other religious faiths and the religiously unaffiliated to be worried that dealing with climate change, that the government will overreact or restrict individual freedoms. These patterns among the highly religious overlap with political views. We show this in detail in our full report on the survey's findings, which you can read on our website at pewresearch.org. But the key point is that people's religious outlook has an impact on their views about climate change, even above and beyond their politics. Another way of saying this is that religion matters even when we control for people's partisan political views. Though to be sure, politics also matters a lot. The survey finds that Democrats tend to be much more concerned than Republicans about climate change. 83% of Democrats and Democratic leaders say that climate change is an extremely or very serious problem, compared with just 1/4 of Republicans and Republican leaders who feel that way. And similar to highly religious Americans, Republicans are more likely than Democrats to predict that in dealing with climate change, the government will overreact by creating many unnecessary environmental regulations. Nearly 2/3 of Republicans say this, compared with about 1 in 5 Democrats. And Republicans are far more likely to predict a gradual loss of individual freedoms because of environmental regulations in the coming decades. However, another major pattern we see in the survey data is that views about climate change vary by age. Younger Americans are more inclined than older Americans to say that climate change is a serious problem. Now, due to sample size, we're showing adults under 40 compared with those 40 and older. Usually our age breaks is looking at 18 to 29-year-olds. But we find that 2/3 of adults under the age of 40 say global climate change is an extremely or very serious problem, compared with about half of adults ages 40 and older. And we see the same pattern when looking at younger versus older Americans who identify or lean Republican. Roughly 1/3 of younger Republicans say global climate change is an extremely or very serious problem, while 1 in 5 older Republicans say the same. Younger Republicans are also more likely than older Republicans to say the Earth is warming mostly because of human activity. Older Republicans, in contrast, are more likely to say that the Earth is warming because of natural patterns in the Earth's environment. And we see a similar pattern when looking within high religious commitment, the high religious commitment group. Again, this group includes people who say they pray each day, they regularly attend religious services, and consider religion very important in their lives. And as I just said a moment ago, highly religious Americans are less concerned about climate change than Americans who are less religious. But younger religious Americans are more likely to be concerned than older religious Americans. Roughly 3/4 of younger, highly religious Americans say they are at least somewhat concerned about climate change, compared with about 6 in 10 highly religious Americans ages 40 and older. And about half of highly religious Americans under the age of 40 say that the Earth's warming is mostly because of human activity, while fewer, 36%, of their counterparts who are 40 and older say the same. Now, to further highlight these patterns, I'm going to continue with my example with evangelical Protestants. I've already pointed out that evangelical Protestants are less likely than members of other religious groups or those who don't affiliate with a religion to be concerned about global climate change. But among evangelicals, those between the ages of 18 and 39 are more likely to say climate change is an extremely or very serious problem, and they're more likely to say the Earth is getting warmer mostly due to human activity. The survey included some follow-up questions for those who say climate change is not too serious a problem or not a problem at all, to try and understand these views better. And overall, many people in this category say that there are much bigger problems in the world today, that God is in control of the climate, that climate change will not have a big impact on most people, or that they don't believe climate change is happening. And when we look specifically among evangelical Protestants across the board, younger evangelicals are less likely to take these positions. For example, younger evangelical Protestants are less likely than their older counterparts to say that climate change is not a serious problem because there are much bigger problems in the world today, completely or mostly describes their views. And they're less likely to say climate change is not a serious problem because God is in control of the climate. Thinking about the potential impact of environmental regulations, while these are more common views among highly religious Americans compared with less religious Americans, younger evangelicals are less likely than older evangelicals to say the US will overreact to global climate change by creating many unnecessary environmental regulations. They're also less likely to say there will be higher prices for fuel and electricity. Younger evangelical Protestants are also less likely to say there will be fewer jobs and declining pay in industries that depend on fossil fuels, or that there will be a gradual loss of individual freedoms. The survey also finds that younger evangelicals are more open to changing their lifestyle for the sake of future generations. 6 in 10 evangelical Protestants between the ages of 18 and 39 say the statement, "I would be willing to make sacrifices in the way I live today if I knew it would help future generations," completely or mostly describes their view. By comparison, half of evangelicals ages 40 and older say the same. And younger evangelicals are less likely than their older counterparts to say they want to live the best life they can right now and not worry too much about the future. When asked about how we as a country should make decisions, younger evangelicals are more likely to say that the statement, "we should consider things that previous generations did not think about," completely or mostly describes their views. And they're less likely to say we should value the same things that were important to the generations that came before us. And so, just to recap, overall, we find that while highly religious Americans are less likely than other adults to express concern about warming temperatures around the globe, younger religious Americans tend to be at least somewhat more concerned. And by zooming in on one such religious group, evangelical Protestants, we can really see this pattern of younger evangelicals showing greater concern for climate change and openness to prioritizing the needs of future generations. That's it for me. I'm going to hand it off now to Leah to guide a deeper discussion on this.
Thank you, Becca, for that fascinating data. The Pew Research Organization has done such a service to us in the religious realm to get some hard data about what it's like out there for preachers, for congregations, to be able to ascertain how climate change is affecting our congregations, and especially the attitudes and the experiences of young people. What we want to do now is talk to some of them and hear directly from them what it is like to be a young person of faith, to be a leader in the climate movement and in their religious organizations. And we have 3 fascinating people with us today. One is Tori Goebel. She is a national organizer and spokesperson for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. We also have with us Alec Castellana. He is the Environmental Justice Coordinator with Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Stockton. He's also a filmmaker and an environmentalist and theologian. And our third panelist today is Rafaela Gold. She is a student at Princeton University and is a college fellow with the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. Now, before we get started with some initial questions for our panel, I want to remind all of you that if you have questions for our panelists, please put them into the chat. We are going to have time to hear from you and then to hear from them about what is important, where you're seeing the intersections between faith, climate, and our younger generation. So let's start with just each of you introducing yourselves, where you are now, what your role is, and what made you want to get involved in environmental issues. Tori, let's start with you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It is so wonderful to be here. My name is Tori Goebel, serving as the national organizer and spokesperson for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. I am located in Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and I got involved because of my faith. Throughout my undergraduate experience and my early professional years, I continue to witness environmental threats and injustices in my own community and across the country. And so my faith is really what made me want to be involved. I believe I am called to love God and love my neighbor. And I don't think I could do that fully or authentically without caring for God's creation and my neighbors suffering from the weight of the climate crisis, pollution, and environmental injustice. I'm looking forward to discussing this more during our conversation here today.
Thank you, Tori, and thank you for being expansive in how we think about our neighbors, not just our human neighbors, but our earthkin and how we can all flourish together. Alec, let's hear from you next.
Yeah, sure. So, hello everybody. My name is Alec Castellano. I work as the Environmental Justice Coordinator at Catholic Charities Diocese of Stockton. We're the only environmental justice program under Catholic Charities USA. What inspired me to get into this work is I've always just been a lifelong advocate for social justice and environmental conservation. I was heavily inspired by the encyclical published by Pope Francis in 2015 titled Laudato Si. And I'm deeply concerned about the pollution hazards here in the northern end of the San Joaquin Valley here in California. And I have grown up in a area that has been heavily impacted by water and air pollution. So that is how I got involved with this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. What you've shared with us highlights the importance not only of place, like what's happening in our own context, but also the ways in which our religious leaders can speak to that, such as with Pope Francis's Laudato Si. So thank you for that. Rafaela, let's hear from you next.
Hi everyone. I'm so honored to be here today. My name is Rafaela. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently a student just finishing up my first year at Princeton, and on campus, I do a lot of work with an environmental organization called Divest Princeton, which puts pressure on the university to divest its endowment from fossil fuels. And then I'm also a college fellow with the organization Aramat, has a subset called the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, and I've been part of that since, I would say, mid-high school. And so I help organize events within the Jewish community on campus about environmentalism and climate activism. And in terms of how I got involved, I always feel like my story is not a very interesting one in that despite having grown up in New York City, I have always had a really strong connection with nature. And I was fortunate to have many opportunities to forge that relationship with nature growing up. And so when I began to fully understand the extremity and the urgency of the climate crisis, when I was in around 8th grade, I remember very specifically this one headline that said 11 years left until the impacts of the climate crisis become irreversible, and feeling this indescribable fear and anxiety around what that would mean and being kind of paralyzed by it. And then finding other people who felt the same way as me and working in community to create a movement together and to create an environmental club at our school. So kind of finding people who felt the same way and who were also feeling this intense fear around the degradation happening to our planet was really helpful in inspiring me to do this work.
Rafaela, I hear that that fear in you. I also hear in your story the importance of faith communities lifting up young people from a very early age. Adama really does a good job with this, ushering high school students into then the college realm and equipping and inspiring them to do this work, and then creating community to do that together, because we can do so much more together than we can ever do alone. So my next question, which I'm going to ask all of you, but I want to stick with you for a minute, Rafaela. And what are you working on right now? Like, what is the focus? What's the urgency? And my follow-up to that is, what do the adults in your life think about this work that you're doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was really unsurprised kind of when I saw these statistics about how religious youth tend to care more about the climate and kind of feel that level of urgency more than adults, because I definitely observe that in my own life with how adults react to the work I'm doing. So in terms of specific things that we're working on, I'm kind of disconnected from the middle school and high school part of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement at this point, but they do a lot of work around mobilizing Jewish middle schools and high schools and synagogues across the country. And they do that through events and like advocacy and demonstrating connections between Judaism and the environment, and kind of going back into our text, into the Torah, and finding those really specific places. In terms of like even the name of Adamah, our organization, we have Adam, which means man, and Adamah, the earth, and how those things are inherently connected, just like trying to bring that message home. And so I think that that's kind of been an effective tactic for them. And then in college, we had an environmental Shabbat just last weekend with a lot of really amazing panelists, and talked about the Jewish practice of Shemitah, which is the 7-year cycle where you let the land rest once every year, and talking about how Judaism is an agriculturally based religion. So bringing it back to the religion is really useful in talking to adults who are already really committed to their faith and really committed to Judaism, and showing them that part of that, and part of what youth see as their Jewish identities, is caring for nature and the environment. And that's not just something we do, it's something we feel compelled to do, that we have to do. And I would say that for the most part, adults in my life have been really receptive to that. And I'm really grateful for the work that older generations have put into this work as well. But I also do feel like younger people are experiencing this climate anxiety at kind of higher levels. And so we're kind of having conversations with the adults in our lives. And I think that adults in the Jewish community really do value youth voices a lot, because there's this practice of Lador Vador, from generation to generation, passing our tradition on and on and on. And so Jewish leaders and adults really care about what young people care about, because they want to help us feel connected to Judaism. And so when we show them we feel connected to Judaism through nature, through the environment, through activism for the climate, and they see we care about that, they realize more that that's something that we want them to be centering in their faith as well.
Yeah, Rafaela, what you're showing us is the importance of connecting this work to our sacred texts and our theology, how we think about God, and how we think about our community. And what you've demonstrated for us is the way in which the Jewish community is really doing a good job of making these connections. So, Alec, I want to turn to you now. And what are you working on? And are you finding the same kind of support that Rafaela described, or are you getting pushback? Are you hitting some walls here and there? And if so, where are you finding openings to make the kind of connections that Rafaela described?
Yeah, sure. So we do really receive a lot of support. There are a lot of great nonprofit organizations around here that support our works. A lot of great community activists, community advocates, elected officials that support our work. Some of the things that we're working on right now is tomorrow we'll be presenting at Santa Clara University's Environmental Justice Conference, which is a Jesuit university, but it's not just organizations of Catholic faith that are going to be there. There's going to be all kinds of different organizations there, such as Little Manila Rising, based out of Stockton, California, such as Power in Nature Coalition, Tuolumne River Trust, a lot of other great organizations supporting us there in our work throughout the year. Another thing that we're working on right now is developing a curriculum based off of Laudato Si that could be implemented into the various parishes throughout our diocese, to support those going through catechism, such as youth and young adults. We stay busy. We definitely stay busy. And although we do receive some pushback some of the time, I think that just comes with the work. There's not always people that are gonna support our work, but I think most of the time, especially here in California, as being one of the states leading on environmental justice issues, we do receive a lot of great support.
I'm really glad to hear that, Alec. And I also know that there in the Central Valley, climate connects to other justice issues, such as the rights of agricultural workers and immigrants who work the fields, and the way climate affects them. So I know some of the pushback may even come from outside of your organization when you try to advocate for some of those more vulnerable populations. So thank you so much for that work. Okay, let's hear from Tori now. All along with Alec and with Rafaela, we're hearing this leadership that they're each providing and their organizations, and you're doing this work as well. So what is your organization focusing on, and how are the adults in your life? I mean, you're an adult, of course, but the older adults, I should say, how are they responding to your work?
So there are three main parts of our work. The first is mobilizing our generation. Right now, that looks like a lot of work with our leadership development programs. Just today, we are finalizing our incoming cohort of college fellows, a program designed to support Christian students on Christian college campuses around the country, as well as we will be recruiting for our community fellowship. That's a newer program designed to support the work and leadership of young Christians in frontline communities. The second part of our work is engaging with our churches. This is a primary reason why YECA was founded. While older evangelicals have typically been slower to accept the reality of climate change and take action, young Christians are looking for ways to take meaningful action through the lens of our faith. And so in my experience, the young people I work with do not have the same distrust of science as their older counterparts. And so right now what we're doing is updating resources on our website and deepening our trainings to provide resources to help young people engage with their churches. And finally, we want to hold our political leaders accountable for bold, just, and transformative climate policies. Right now, we're actually working a lot on the regulatory side, driving people out to hearings at the EPA to offer public comment and testimony on various rules, including the recent methane hearings and looking at the mercury and air toxic standard next, as well as exploring IRA, Inflation Reduction Act implementation, and the Farm Bill coming up as well. So a lot still happening in the Washington, D.C. in the policy and regulatory space as well. In my own life, I have been really blessed with support of my family, support of YECA's parent organization, the Evangelical Environmental Network, doing great work with older evangelicals, as well as YECA's senior advisors. But like the research says, time and again, we're seeing, and this aligns with my experience at YECA, there is that generational divide, and that is why I think it is imperative to empower and equip young people to have these conversations.
Thank you so much for that, Tori. That is so comprehensive. I love that you're working on all of these different areas, especially the public theology of the faith community engaging in the public square. If we can mobilize what I call the sleeping giant of the faith community in the same way the civil rights organized that, it was churches and synagogues that powered this movement. And that kind of thing needs to happen now. So I want to just remind our audience, if you have questions for our panelists, please put them into the chat. We'll be getting to those questions in a few minutes. But I want to actually pick up on something that you were talking about, Tori, regarding the older generation not prioritizing climate the way your generation does. And some of the things that I sometimes hear is that, climate and environmental issues are just either not part of faith, like we need to be focusing on salvation, we need to be focusing on some of those spiritual values, or we need to focus on other pressing societal issues like feeding the poor. So what do you say to people who see a separation or a diminishment of climate and environmental issues? How do you help them make those connections? Go ahead, Tori.
Great. So I think there is a really popular and pervasive misconception that climate change is an issue that you should care about instead of or before other issues. I think ultimately climate change connects to every facet of our lives, including these other pressing issues. Of course, folks are worried about the rising cost of living, food security, having family-sustaining jobs, the health of their children. The reality is that climate change is intimately connected with these concerns. It is not separate. Transitioning to a healthy, clean energy future is directly related to things like the cost of living and job security. Reducing pollution is directly tied to the health of our communities. Climate change connects to all of our very real concerns like mental health, racial justice, access to healthy food, and clean water. So I often tell people that the first step in talking to someone about climate change is to actually listen. Stop and listen to the values and concerns being shared. That's how we can connect climate change to these core issues that people already care about. For any climate communication, including with the communities that YECA engages with, it's vital that we lead with stories and those shared values. Facts and statistics are important, but it's often those stories and personal relationships that are going to move hearts and minds. In Christian spaces, we refer to stories of transformation and value as testimonies. And so YECA, we equip our leaders and volunteers with the tools to craft their own climate testimonies, stories of how and why they came to care about the climate crisis and what they are doing in response. These testimonies include stories, but also build on shared values from the Bible, sermons, things we learned growing up in church. And it's important to note that the messenger is often just as important as the message. And that's why I believe young Christians are the best people to reach our older counterparts, particularly those evangelicals who might be more hesitant to dive in with these climate discussions.
Tori, that is a very important insight. The power of narrative, the power of story. And this is not in any way to diminish the hard facts that Pew gathers for us, that quantitative data, but the qualitative data is important as well. And so how we frame this biblically, theologically, so that it resonates with people's values is so important. So Alec, here's my next question for you. Can you tell us a story of something that has happened in your work or your life where you saw people have an aha moment where they connected, oh, yes, taking care of God's creation is consistent with my faith, is consistent with my values. Have you seen this happen in your work, and can you share an example of this?
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of those aha moments happen during our public presentations that we give at the different parishes that we're involved with. A lot of the times we find that folks, especially older folks, may be disconnected with how um, how pollution affects their everyday lives. For example, a lot of the times we go through a tool called CalEnviroScreen, which is a tool funded by the California state government that pinpoints what pollution hazards are affecting a certain area in California. So you can go onto that website and type in any address, and it'll tell you on a scale from 0 to 100% how affected your community is by water pollution, air pollution, all kinds of different things. And once they see that California, although we have a lot of progressive environmental policies implemented, that we still suffer a lot from pollution. A lot of the northern end of the San Joaquin Valley is in the 90 to 100% percentile of water pollution, air pollution. We have some of the highest asthma rates throughout the country. We have communities like Stockton, California, that have extremely high rates of lung cancer, extremely high rates of cardiovascular disease, which can all be connected to PM 2.5 emissions, which comes out of the tailpipes of many different gas-powered engines. And so when people realize, why do I have asthma? Why am I seeing these health issues at such a young age? Why do my children have asthma? It's because of the toxic air and the toxins that are located in the water. So I think once they become educated on these kind of subjects, it kind of gives them that aha, like this is the reason why. So yeah, that's one example.
So what you're doing in your work is, first of all, you're connecting science and faith to show that science can actually inform a faithful decision about how we're going to transport ourselves, feed ourselves, heat and cool our homes, and pay attention to, in the Bible, what is called, in the New Testament, the least of these. How do we care for the least of these? And yet, what I'm also hearing you note is that these things that are in the air, in the water, what we do to the water, we actually do to ourselves. And that connects me back to what Adama is all about, Rafaela, that we are earthlings. We are made of the stuff of earth. And so when we take care of that, we take care of ourselves. And yet we have not been doing this for hundreds of years. And even if we started pulling together tomorrow, the effects of this are going to be with us for generations, and it can feel very heavy and depressing. So I'm wondering, Rafaela, how are you sustaining your own spirit when you realize the weight of all of this now and going forward? What is sustaining you in what I call the dark night of the green soul?
That's a really, really beautiful way of putting it. I haven't heard it like that before, but such an important question. I think part of it goes back to the narratives, to going back to more specific. This is such a broad, overarching, sweeping issue, as Tori touched on. It's so intersectional. It relates to every aspects of our lives, and I think that's kind of part of what makes people kind of think of it more as an over there issue from time to time. It's going to happen in the future. It's going to happen to other people, but not me. Or it's just too big to think about, and it feels very isolating when you're hit with that kind of fear, and very hard to comprehend. So I think part of it is going back to those individual narratives. What's one climate story that you have? Why do you care about the land that you are standing on? Not any other land over there, but the land that you are standing on, or land that has mattered to you in the past. And I definitely have friends who can tell beautiful stories about growing up in Oklahoma, hearing tornado sirens, all of that. And I always feel very moved by those stories. And then another thing is working in community, working in movements, and not kind of in a vacuum. I think that it's so hard to know where to begin. And the emphasis on individual action is something that has been spread by fossil fuel companies, and by companies that want us to think that it's our fault and not a systemic issue. And so understanding yourself as environmentally responsible, but not necessarily guilty, and holding the people who are guilty accountable in community with other people, I think is really important. And finding people who have those shared values, and then sticking with it and being together and making it fun also is so important. In Divest Princeton, we have these huge art builds with music and snacks and art supplies, and we make posters and banners for our events, and it's fun, and it makes people want to come back and do it again. And so making advocacy fun is not impossible, and I think that that is really, really helpful in sustaining people in this work.
I love that. I will say, I have made some of my best friends out of the worst situations. When you are locking arms and you're protesting fracking in central Pennsylvania, as I've done, you connect with people across lines of interdenominational, interfaith, and it's just very inspiring. The other thing I really want to underscore is a distinction that you made, Rafaela, that we are all responsible, but the guilt is really a systemic thing, and we need to be thinking systemically, and not just, okay, I've changed my light bulbs, I'm done, or I bought an electric car, check that off, I'm good. We have to think systemically and not just individualistically, or we're gonna miss the mark here. We are going to start moving to our questions from the audience here in a moment, but Tori, I wanted to give you an opportunity to also share a story that that you think sort of exemplifies somebody having an aha moment and making that connection, or maybe a story of place that grounds or inspires you? So what's your story?
I appreciate this question. I guess I'll share my own story, speaking from my own experience of when I had an aha moment on the climate crisis. I didn't hear about climate change or the environment growing up in church. My church was really focused on mission trips and caring for our neighbors, but those discussions were not extended to the natural world, to the environment. We weren't discussing the variety of scriptures that talk about environmental stewardship. So it wasn't until I went to college, Gordon College, a small Christian school here in Massachusetts, that I even became aware of the realities of the climate crisis. And we started to learn about communities here in the United States being impacted by things like land erosion, rising sea levels, food insecurity. And it broke my heart, and I became confused why Christians were not leading on this issue when I saw very clear connections with my faith, with and then what science was telling us about what was happening with the climate crisis. So that was my aha moment. And one trend I've seen is more and more young people, the younger they get, they're hearing about this in high school, even before on the news. They're having these aha moments much earlier. They don't even necessarily have aha moments. It's just something they understand intuitively, and they connect that to their faith, and they're just ready to take action.
Wow, that is so inspiring. But we're starting to get some questions in, and one that I want to just throw out to each of you is the question of politics. And that was something that came up in the data, that those who are more conservative in their politics just are not as convinced as you all are that this is an issue. And I'm wondering, and Alec, let's start with you. How are you finding ways to thread the needle, so to speak, in the political divide when you're trying to talk about issues of climate and faith?
Yeah, sure. So I think that one thing we kind of forget, especially us as American Catholics, is that our religion and faith in Christ is supposed to be nonpartisan, not left or right, but grounded more in the teachings of Christ, the teachings of the church. So when we look at issues revolving around climate justice and how it relates to politics, we kind of think of it as more of a modern issue, something that is just being brought and kind of stuffed down the throats of the modern era. But, if you look at the history of the church and you look at certain leaders such as St. Francis of Assisi, these are caring for the planet, caring for the earth, caring for the environment, caring for biodiversity is something that has been taught for many, many years. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, better known as Pope Francis, took the name of Francis when he was elected as Pope to honor the work that was done by St. Francis of Assisi. One of the most early recorded pieces of literature in the Italian language is something called the Canticle of the Sun, which is a song or a prayer that revolves around care for creation, care for the planet. And I think that we as Catholics need to kind of take knowledge of these teachings from the past to see that this is not a modern issue, but this is something that our religion has supported for many years now.
Yeah, that's I think that's really important, like finding that shared common ground, those values, those things that we can say, look, we may not agree on everything, but this is a place where we can start. And what would be our next step from here is what I hear you saying there. Now, Tori, I'd like you to address this question as well, especially, and somebody had a follow-up. you're doing a lot of policy work. You're trying to do advocacy. You're trying to get out there and think about how do we engage politicians. And there just seems to be like we're just mired in such dysfunction right now. How do you get around that pessimism? How do you get out of the quicksand? What is your organization found to be effective when dealing with the ineffectiveness surrounding the climate crisis?
It's a great question, and Alec touched on a lot of the key principles, like building on those shared values and starting with story, like we've already discussed. At YUCA, we're not doing this because we're Democrats or Republicans or even environmentalists. We're doing this at YUCA because we are followers of Christ, striving to live out our Christian calling. And we think that acting on climate is just an authentic way to do that. And so that is how we frame our messaging. That is how we lead. It is just an authentic expression of who we are. And so we are not leading with partisan talking points, typical environmentalist talking points. We often lead with scripture, stories about why we came to learn about this through the lens of our faith, how the things we grew up hearing in church inform our interests and desire to take action right now. That is really important. I also think young evangelicals have a unique and powerful voice with decision makers who may have typically relied on the votes of our older evangelical parents to be safe votes, to perhaps typically vote Republican, like the studies show us, but rather saying, young Christians actually care about the climate crisis, regardless of political party, and we want to vote for people and support candidates who take this issue seriously, no matter what. And so I think it's important that we use a unique and prophetic voice to hold people accountable in that way as well.
I love that. I think that is slowly starting to dawn on some of our political leaders, that if they're not going to pay attention to the issues that are driving the votes of the up and coming and present younger generation, they are going to lose political power. And it also leverages the power of the 18 to 39 bracket that Becca was showing us, to say we have more power than we think. So I think mobilizing young people, getting them to the polls, doing that really just on the ground work is critical. So Rafaela, let's switch gears a little bit here. And I want to ask you about a question that came up in the chat. How do you make connections to people who are not in the faith community? And have you found that your organization, or maybe like, there at Princeton, are you finding ways to make connections with non-religious people using religious language, or is that not so much happening in your context?
I would say that it can be, I think coming to college was kind of one of the first experiences I actually had of needing to do that. How before in my life, I'd gone to a Jewish school my whole life, Jewish summer camps. And so all of the work that I was doing, I mean, maybe wasn't even necessarily explicitly tied to Judaism, but it was being worked into our holidays, finding different ways to give gratitude for the land via blessings and that kind of thing. All of that was very faith related. And so I only had to kind of start coming at the issue in a different way in college, and also wanted to. There were so many more environmental organizations than just the Jewish one that I'm running within the Jewish community. And so that's kind of how I got involved in Divest Princeton. And I think that kind of realizing that these two aspects of our identities are interconnected for those of us who come to the work from a religious lens. It's not like religion and the environment. They really are inseparable from one another. But also that doesn't make like the environmentalism part of it any less because it's tied to religion. And so we can very easily still connect people who aren't coming at this issue from a religious angle, who care about creation, not because of the religion they were raised in, but maybe because of the natural environment in which they were raised, or the values with which they were raised. So many people are raised with values that I think of as religious values, but which many would just think of as moral values. And I think that is also really important, realizing we all have this value of gratitude for the land. We all have this value of kind of figuring out how to live in reciprocal relationship with nature and give what we can back. And I think also making it intersectional and working with other groups. For example, recently at the environmental Shabbat that I helped host, we invited all of the campus environmental organizations to come to the dinner and just be there representing their organizations and stand up and say a few words about what they do. And so we had the Birding Society and the Garden and the Sustainability Student Government Group and the group that advocates for New Jersey policy, and all of these different groups all coming together under the same roof, saying we can't all do everything under this issue because it's so large, but we're all doing something and trying to spark interest in one of those many aspects of this issue is one way I would say I find it easy to connect with people who aren't part of a faith community but care a lot about climate. And I think we can all really support each other in this work from wherever we come at in it. At a certain point, the background is what gets us here, but once we're here, we're all here together. And so I think that's really important.
Rafaela, what you're showing here in that description of what's happening at Princeton is that the faith community can make space for other organizations, again, on the basis of shared values. And I think one of the things that's really important in this work that all three of you have really illustrated is that there does not need to be this clash between science and religion. That in fact, and I know that a lot of secular environmentalists are very suspicious of those who profess any kind of faith, because we've probably deserved our bad rap about being anti-science and not caring about these things. So when we can show that actually we do care and we can be informed by the science in order to make moral and ethical decisions about how we live in community together, I think that's a very powerful way to heal our divisions in the human community and also with the natural community. So we're coming to the end of our time here, and I want to lift up a question that came to us from Catherine that is about revitalizing religion itself. You know, we've talked about how do we revitalize our communities and creation, but you know, a lot of leaders in houses of worship are probably wondering, well, how do I partner with these wonderful young people, but we have no young people in our congregation? So do you have any suggestions for how congregations, how houses of worship can bridge that gap and reach out to youth and young adults around climate and environmental issues? And Alec, let's start with you on that. Oh, did we lose Alec? Okay, while we're waiting for Alec to come back, let's go to Tori and let's hear your ideas for this.
I'm so glad that we have the chance to discuss this question. One of the findings in the report is that climate change does not seem to be a major area of focus in US congregations. It said just 8% hear a great deal or quite a bit about climate change in their churches. And so because of that, I think churches should start talking about climate and environmental issues, have a sermon or sermon series, consider hosting public events like an Earth Day celebration for the whole community, not just people in the church, start a ministry focused on creation care and community outreach. I think churches should start taking this issue seriously and start talking about it, not just to reach young people, but because it is an important, authentic expression of our faith and our calling as followers of Christ. For churches with young people, I encourage them to create space for the young people to lead and speak into the life of the church. We had a YECA fellow that was invited to offer us a sermon on creation care at her home church. And I think things like that are really important because it's no secret that young Christians are leaving the church. I find that isn't out of hatred or loss of faith, but a reaction to the fact that churches, particularly American evangelical churches, are failing to meet the moment and translate faith into action. It has to start there. And I know so many young people who are ready and eager to talk about this in their places of worship, but haven't been listened to or even given a chance to help improve the church in this way.
Tori, two things that I want to highlight in what you said. First of all, the faith communities have the opportunity to equip their young people as leaders now. We often say in the Christian church, oh, the young people are the church of the future. No, they are the church right now. And if they are given the tools and the support and the inspiration and education, they can lead right now. So that is very important. The other thing that I want to lift up from what you said is that this is not just about, well, let's find a way to bring the young people back. Because in some cases, it may be that the young people aren't coming back to your congregation. So we need to figure out how to meet them where they are. So going out into community, hosting community events so that people will look at this and say, oh, you actually care about what we care about. Then let's see where we can work together. So I love that. I love that. So Alec, you're back. Let's hear your ideas for bridging those gaps, those generational gaps from your perspective.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes,
I'm
you're
sorry.
good to go. It's okay.
Some
That's
connectivity
okay.
issues. But yeah, I think that when bringing young people into getting involved in the church in terms of climate justice issues, you have to provide them incentives for their time. Nobody works for free. And when you show that you value their input and you value their time, it really motivates them to want to get more involved. Providing things like food, or providing things like even childcare, or chances to advance their resume or their career aspirations. This is what really inspires young people, and they want to get involved. They see these issues as something that affects their future. Especially with the youth, they're still trying to navigate their place in this world, and being thrown into a society where they see all these conflicts and they hear about all these problems on the news all the time, like, oh, this is going bad, this is wrong. They want to have a positive view for their future, so they want to get involved in things like this, but you have to show them that you value their input. And I think that providing them certain kind of incentives to get involved really goes a long way.
I love that idea of incentives and paying people for their work, including young people. I've often said to congregations too, set up a scholarship for young people who are going into environmental science or climate science, and they apply for it, and if they get it, ask them to come to your congregation and give a talk about what they're learning. Create those connections and value their work for right now. All right, Raphael, I'm going to give you the last word on this. How can the faith community bridge that gap between the older generation and the younger generation?
Yeah, I definitely just will mostly be echoing what Tori and Alec have said. I think that those are both really, really important suggestions, both meeting people where they're at and also providing incentives. One of the organizations that I'm currently working with is called Repair the World, from the Hebrew Tikkun Olam. And that organization has a fund for students who are doing this kind of work on college campuses, and provide a lot of support for having service-related and environmental-related events. And they have trainings for how to do that on the college campus. So I've found that really, really supportive in the work I'm doing, just as kind of a tangible example. And then I would say, in terms of revitalizing faith and caring about religion in young people, a lot of it is about meeting people where they're at, and also bringing them in and uplifting them and saying, we are not trying to tell you what to say or trying to create a program and just sticking you somewhere in the program. We want to work with you to create that programming, and we want to ask you, what do you need and what do you want to say? And providing ways to amplify youth voices but still provide room for youth voices and have youth be the ones leading and speaking, and being partners in this work rather than just people who you're trying to involve and take in, I think is really important. And being seen as a partner can help people feel a lot more motivated, because then they have a stake in it and it feels like it's also theirs. And so that's really what it's all about, making the religion also feel like it's also their religion and not just something outdated or antiquated, but something that they can really bring into their lives. And I think that that's really something that's possible to do through the issue of environmentalism, because it's so baked into tradition. It goes both ways. It's not just, oh, we can get people who are already religious to care about environmentalism because they're religious, but we can get people who maybe aren't so religious to see the importance of religion through environmentalism and through seeing how present it is in many religious texts, not just Judaism and Christianity, but so many world religions. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And there, there's Wisconsin Green Muslims. There are environmental movements in almost, I think, every major religion. And so what you're saying there gives me so much hope, because there is incredible potential, Rafaela, that you have pointed out, as well, Alec and Tori. You have given us such hope, such inspiration, so many great ideas that I'll be able to share with my own students and places where I speak. I'm sure, Becca, as you're hearing their stories, this is like fleshing out the data for you in ways that are like, ooh, now we can go study this. So, Becca, do you want to just like one sentence or two about like what you're hearing from these young people that's inspiring you and giving you hope?
I mean, I think one thing that's really great about this talk is just that, we always want people to be able to see themselves in our data. And it's just great that, you all are able to bring life to that and help people understand, the things that we're seeing, the patterns that we're finding in the data. So I'm just very grateful for this whole session to really kind of breathe life into it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for tuning in for this incredible discussion that we've had. Huge thanks to the Pew Research Center for putting the time, the energy, the human hours that went into this, the technology, the funders who supported this. This has been such an incredible learning experience that we're going to be unpacking for years to come. And thanks to all of you who have put your excellent questions into the chat. They have helped to further this discussion. And I just thank all of you and encourage you to keep encouraging young people in this work, supporting them, and deepening your own faith in this process. Because as I said earlier, together, we can do so much more together than we can ever do alone. Thank you all, and have a good rest of your afternoon.